The handcuffs were cold. That's the first thing I remember. Not the sound of my front door being kicked in, not the blinding flashlights sweeping across my bedroom ceiling, not even the voices shouting my name in the dark. Just the cold of the metal closing around my wrists at 2 a.m, inside the home I had worked my entire adult life to build. But the handcuffs weren't what broke something inside me that night. It was the sidewalk. Because when they walked me through my own front door and down my porch steps, my family was standing there waiting. Not crying, not shocked, not reaching for me. Standing there with the particular stillness of people who had been anticipating this moment for a long time and were finally, completely satisfied. My younger sister Jade had her phone up. She was live streaming it, talking to her audience in the bright, rehearsed voice she used for content, telling over 800,000 followers that justice was finally arriving for everything I had done, that the family's nightmare was ending tonight. I kept my head straight. I kept my face still. And as the patrol car door closed behind me and the red and blue lights started moving away from the house I grew up rebuilding my life inside, I felt something settle in my chest that was almost calm. Because they thought this was the end of me. They had absolutely no idea it was the end of them. 15 minutes after we arrived at the station, the police chief walked into the interrogation room with a file folder in his hands and an expression on his face that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. His hands were shaking, visibly, and what he said to me in that room changed everything that came after. But first, let me take you back to where this really started. My name is Isabel. I'm 28 years old, and I used to believe, the way you believe things that have never been tested, that family was the one place in the world where you were unconditionally safe. My grandfather, Edmund, built that belief in me personally. Edmund was a self-made man in the truest sense. Not inherited wealth, not fortunate timing, just decades of disciplined, intelligent work that eventually built a real estate portfolio worth several $1 million and a reputation in the legal community that commanded genuine respect. He had been a federal judge for over 20 years before he retired. He was sharp, principled, and had the particular quality that truly wise people have of seeing through things very quickly. He saw through my parents and my sister a long time before I did. My parents, Philip and Constance, and my sister Jade had always treated Edmund less like a grandfather and more like a resource they needed to stay adjacent to. Visits happened when money was needed. Phone calls happened when favours were required. The warmth was real enough on the surface, but underneath it was purely transactional, and Edmund, I think, always knew it. 3 years ago, Edmund was diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition that was going to get worse before it got better and was not going to get better. When the diagnosis arrived, my parents immediately became very busy. Philip had commitments. Constance had a social schedule that genuinely could not be rearranged. Jade was in a critical phase of building her online following and couldn't afford the disruption of regular hospital visits. They each had very reasonable-sounding explanations, and collectively they added up to, none of them were coming. So I came. I gave up my position at a property management firm, sublet my apartment, and moved into Edmund's house. For 3 years, I managed his medications, kept his medical appointments, coordinated with his care team, sat with him through the nights that were hard, and was there for the mornings that were better. I learned his routines down to the smallest detail. I learned which nurses he liked and which doctors made him anxious and exactly how he took his tea when he couldn't sleep. And in those 3 years, in the quiet hours between the hard parts, he talked to me. Really talked. About his life, his regrets, his observations about people, his hopes for what came after him. He told me more than once that he had learned something important watching his family from a hospital bed. That love without action is just sentiment, and sentiment doesn't hold your hand at 2 a.m. He was talking about my parents. We both knew it. When Edmund passed away peacefully 4 months ago, the will was read in his solicitor's office with all of us present, He had left the majority of his estate to me. The masks came off before we'd even left the building. My parents and Jade didn't contest the will publicly at first. Edmund had been completely lucid when he signed it, with 2 independent witnesses and his lifelong solicitor present. A direct contest would have gone nowhere. So they chose a different route. They hired a private attorney, the kind who charges a great deal and asks very few ethical questions. And over the following weeks, they assembled a package of forged financial documents. The documents were detailed and professionally produced. They showed what appeared to be a systematic pattern of transfers out of Edmund's accounts during his illness. Transfers that, according to the paperwork, bore my authorization. The charge they built was estate fraud and grand larceny at a scale that carried serious criminal consequences. But forged documents alone weren't enough for what they had planned. They needed public pressure. Jade built that. She posted a series of videos over 2 weeks, carefully edited, emotionally calibrated, tearful in exactly the right moments, describing how her vulnerable elderly grandfather had been isolated by his manipulative granddaughter and systematically stripped of his life savings while he was too ill to protect himself. She was compelling. She knew her audience, and she knew how to make them feel things. The comments filled up fast. The anger spread. People who had never heard of Edmund, or me, or any of us, were signing petitions and flooding the local police department's public accounts, demanding action. The pressure became significant enough that the department, looking at what appeared to be substantial documentary evidence and facing enormous public scrutiny, fast-tracked a warrant. That's how 2 officers ended up kicking in my door at 2 a.m. And that's how my sister ended up live streaming it to 800,000 people who believed every word she had told them. The booking room smelled like stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. I was directed to a metal chair, wrists still cuffed behind me, under lights that were too bright for 2 a.m. The booking officer, older, grey-haired, the practiced indifference of someone who had processed hundreds of these, pulled up my case file on his terminal and asked for my name and date of birth without looking up. I gave them to him calmly. He opened the digital file, started entering the standard information, and then stopped. His fingers went still over the keyboard. His eyes moved across the screen, and something shifted in his face that was not routine indifference anymore. He read for several seconds without moving. Then he looked up at me. A long, slow look that was trying to categorize something it hadn't encountered before. Without saying a word, he pushed his chair back, stood, took the physical file jacket, and walked quickly into the hallway, where I heard him speaking in low, urgent tones to a colleague, then to someone else. The 15 minutes I spent alone in that interrogation room were some of the longest of my life. The clock on the wall ticked. The fluorescent light hummed. I kept my eyes on the door and my breathing even, and I waited because I knew, I had known since the moment the handcuffs went on, that what was in that file was going to do the work I couldn't do for myself. The door opened with a sharp bang. The police chief came in alone. He was not carrying the posture of a man arriving to process a suspect. He was pale, and the folder in his hands had a slight but visible tremble to it that he wasn't trying to hide. He sat down across from me, set the folder on the table between us, and took a breath that was longer than it needed to be. "Ma'am," he said, "you are not the suspect in this file." He paused, looked at me directly. "You are the appointed federal trustee of this jurisdiction's Emergency Development Fund, and your grandfather was a retired federal judge who appears to have known exactly what was coming." What Edmund had done was this. Weeks before he passed, working quietly with his long-standing federal estate attorney, he had assembled a protective legal file that had been lodged directly with the appropriate federal authority. Inside it was a notarized protective order, a complete documented record of the forged documents my parents had been preparing, because Edmund, sharp and principled until the end, had anticipated exactly what they would do the moment he was gone. There was more. Edmund had secretly recorded my parents attempting to bribe a member of his medical staff, trying to have him declared mentally incompetent so they could challenge the will on those grounds. The recordings were dated, authenticated, and lodged as evidence. Every significant move my parents had made in the weeks before and after his passing had been logged, witnessed, and sealed into that file before he died. He had also done something else that I found difficult to speak about for a long time, without my voice changing. He had deliberately left an older, more accessible version of his estate records visible, one he knew my parents would find and attempt to exploit. He had built a door and left it open, knowing their greed would walk them through it. The public arrest, the live stream, the 800,000 witnesses Jade had assembled, all of it had created an enormous and thoroughly documented record of exactly what my family had done. They had built the prosecution's case themselves. The chief explained this to me in the kind of measured, careful tone that people use when they are also processing something as they speak. Then he stood up, came around the table, and personally removed the handcuffs from my wrists. He apologised, sincerely, for the theatre of it. I walked to the large window that looked out over the processing area, and I stood there and I waited. Within minutes, the double doors opened. My parents came through first. Philip's face had lost every trace of the satisfaction I had seen on that sidewalk. Constance looked like a person who had just understood something terrible and too late. Jade came through behind them, and for one moment her eyes found mine through the glass. And what I saw in her face was not defiance or anger. It was the specific expression of someone watching their own story collapse. The charges against them were read aloud by a processing officer in the flat. Procedural tone of someone listing items from a document. Grand larceny. Systematic forgery of legal documents, filing a false police report, extortion, elder financial abuse. The handcuffs that had been on my wrists 40 minutes earlier were on theirs now. The aftermath moved quickly and without much drama, which is often how real consequences arrive. Jade's live stream, the one she had designed as the instrument of my public destruction, became the instrument of her own. 800,000 people watched in real time as the narrative reversed completely. The comments changed direction. The petitions disappeared. The same internet mob that had demanded my arrest began demanding accountability for what had been done to me. Several major platforms removed her content for containing what was now clearly documented misinformation. Her following collapsed faster than it had grown. My parents and sister faced the full weight of the charges against them. Their assets were frozen pending investigation. The legal costs alone were substantial. The social standing they had built so carefully and protected so aggressively dissolved in the weeks that followed, in the way that reputations built on performance always eventually do, quickly and completely. The legal proceedings against me were dropped before the week was out. An official clearance letter arrived at my temporary address, and I read it sitting on the floor of a hotel room because I hadn't yet sorted out where I was going next. Then I folded it carefully and put it somewhere safe. I sold the estate 6 months after everything concluded, the house, the portfolio, the properties Edmund had spent decades building. I worked with his solicitors to manage the process properly, the way he would have wanted, with documentation and care and no shortcuts. With what I inherited, I did 2 things. I bought a small house in a coastal town 3 hours from where I had grown up, with a garden that needs work and a view of the water from the kitchen window. I have been working on the garden slowly on the weekends. I think Edmund would have liked it. And I established a fund in his name for elderly care in the area, specifically for people going through serious illness who don't have family support. People who need someone to sit with them through the hard nights and be there for the better mornings. The fund covers practical things: care coordination, transport to appointments, someone to just be present. I think about Edmund often, about the man who saw everything coming and said nothing to me because he didn't want to burden me with it, who built a quiet, careful legal structure around the people he loved and trusted the truth to do the rest. who held my hand through his own darkest nights while simultaneously protecting my future with the same steady precision he had brought to everything else in his long, principled life. He taught me that the truth doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It just needs to be documented. I learned that sitting in a cold metal chair in a police station at 2 a.m, waiting for a file to speak for itself, it spoke clearly enough. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the person in the room that no one believed until the proof made it impossible to deny, leave a comment below. And subscribe if you haven't yet, because there are more stories coming that remind you the truth always finds its way out eventually.